The Galactic Council station, known as Meridian 7, floated quietly between three solar systems, a massive ring of polished metal and glowing corridors that never slept. Every species that had achieved faster-than-light travel had sent at least one representative here. The Velhari, the Draenox, the Solmari, the Crithari. They all walked these halls in their natural forms, some with 4 legs, some with no legs at all, some breathing gases that would kill a human in seconds. It was a place of extraordinary diversity, wrapped in a thin skin of carefully maintained diplomacy. Ambassador Zariel of the Solmari had been stationed at Meridian 7 for 14 cycles, which translated to roughly 6 years in the human measurement of time. She was tall and elegant by Solmari standards. Bioluminescent markings along her neck that shifted color with her mood, eyes the deep amber of her home star at midday, and 4 slender fingers on each hand that could move with extraordinary precision. She was considered one of the finest diplomats her species had ever produced, a voice of calm in heated negotiations, a bridge between cultures that did not always want to be bridged. She wore the silver robe of the Solmari diplomatic corps with quiet pride. She had, in her years at Meridian 7, developed a cautious respect for many species. The Velhari were intellectually dazzling. The Draenox were deeply honorable, if a little rigid. The Crithari made her nervous. Their biology made emotional readings nearly impossible, but she had learned to work with them. Humans, however, she had not yet figured out. Earth had only joined the Galactic Council 8 years ago, which made them younger than even Zariel's own diplomatic career. They were a curious species, small, fragile, barely past the biological baseline that most spacefaring races left behind centuries ago. No natural armor, no venom, no enhanced regeneration. Their lifespans were short. Their bodies were soft. They needed specific temperature ranges, specific pressures, specific gases to breathe. They were, by almost every biological measurement the Council used, remarkably unimpressive. Most of the elder races treated them with a polite sort of tolerance, like a child who had managed to say something clever at the adults' table. Zariel had never been cruel about it. She simply hadn't thought much about humans at all. They were new. They were fragile. They were, as far as she was concerned, a minor player in a very large game. That changed the day she was assigned a human bodyguard. His name was Sergeant Marcus Cole. He arrived at her suite on a Thursday morning, a day name she had learned to track because the humans on the station seemed to organize their emotional energy around what day of the week it was, carrying a single black duffel bag and a data tablet. He was not what she expected. She had expected something louder, perhaps, more performative. Some of the human diplomats she had met were excellent performers. Marcus Cole was not performing anything. He was simply there. He was of average height for a human male, which meant he barely reached her shoulder. His hair was dark and cut very short. His face had lines in it. Not from age, she would later learn, but from years of squinting in bright environments and something the humans called stress. His eyes were a dark brown that caught light in a way she found oddly interesting. He moved through her suite doing a quiet security sweep without asking permission, checked every exit, tested the locking mechanisms on the windows, and then stood near the door with his hands behind his back and said, "All secure, Ambassador. I'll be outside when you need me." She studied him. "You are very quiet for a human." "I find that quiet helps me hear things," he said. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and he left. The Council had assigned him because of escalating security concerns. There had been 2 incidents in recent months, one involving a Crithari dissident group and one involving something more worrying that the Council's security division had not yet fully classified. Zariel had been offered a Velhari security officer first. She had declined, citing political optics. Then a Draenox soldier. She had declined that too. The Draenox were fine warriors but deeply territorial, and having one standing outside her door sent a message she didn't want to send. The human had been the compromise. Quiet, neutral, unintimidating to other species. Easy to overlook. That was the point, she supposed. He was easy to overlook. And she did, for the first several weeks. He was there every morning when she left her suite. He was there every evening when she returned. He stood outside meeting rooms while she negotiated trade routes and resource agreements. He accompanied her through the station's outer rings, where the atmosphere cycled between species-compatible zones, without ever complaining about the Solmari-adjusted air mix she required. He ate his meals at odd hours. She noticed once that he had not eaten for nearly 10 hours during a long negotiation session and showed no sign of it affecting his performance. She asked him about it later. "Humans can go quite a while without food," he said simply. "We were built for it." Built for it. An interesting phrase. She noticed other things too, slowly, the way you notice the grain of wood only after you have spent enough time in the same room with a piece of furniture. He never seemed bored, though he had to spend enormous amounts of time simply standing still. He read, sometimes, on a small device he kept in his jacket pocket, but he was always watching at the same time, the way some creatures could process two streams of information without confusion. He had a habit of mapping exits as soon as he entered any room. She caught him doing it without thinking, his eyes tracing the walls in a quick pattern. He always knew where she was, even in crowded spaces, even when she moved without telling him. She tested this once, deliberately crossing to the other side of a busy reception hall without warning. He was beside her in 11 seconds. "How did you?" she started. "You moved toward the Critheri cluster," he said. "That's unusual for you." I wanted to be close. She had not realized she was being that predictable. She had not realized he was paying that level of attention. She filed it away. A quiet human who paid attention. Fine. That was his job. She still did not think much of it. Then came the night of the Meridian Accord reception, a formal dinner hosted in the Great Hall on the station's upper ring, attended by representatives of 22 species. Zirael wore her formal robes, the deep blue ones with silver trim that the Solmari reserved for occasions of significant political weight. She had 2 major negotiations to advance that evening. She was focused, prepared, moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of a diplomat who had done this 10,000 times. She did not notice the Draenok security officer near the eastern wall behaving strangely. She did not notice the way his posture had shifted, the subtle wrongness in the angle of his shoulders, the fact that he had been standing in the same spot for 40 minutes without moving toward the refreshment stations, which the Draenoks universally could not resist. She did not notice any of it. She was thinking about trade margins and the Critheri delegation's new demand about mineral rights in the Yelther system. Marcus Cole noticed all of it. He had been noticing it for 20 minutes. And he had been quietly, calmly, moving her toward the center of the room without her realizing it. Using the gentle pressure of proximity, the way he angled his body, the timing of his quiet suggestions about which conversations to approach next, until she was exactly where he wanted her to be when the eastern wall exploded. The explosion was not large by the standards of actual warfare. It was precise, a shaped charge, the Council's investigators would later confirm, designed not to destroy the hall, but to create a specific corridor of chaos. Panels blew inward. A support beam cracked and dropped half a meter before the station's emergency bracing caught it. The lights died for 3 full seconds before backup power kicked in, flooding the hall in red emergency light that turned every face the color of something wounded. 14 of the 22 species in the room had acute hearing sensitivity. The pressure wave of the blast alone sent them reeling. Screaming, in at least 6 different languages, filled the air. Zirael didn't fall. She was too trained for that. But she froze. Just for a half second. One moment of pure biological shock. The kind no amount of diplomatic training could fully prepare a person for. Her bioluminescent markings went dark, which among the Solmari was the equivalent of going white with terror. Marcus Cole was already moving. She felt his hand close around her wrist before she even processed that he had crossed the 3 meters between them. Not rough, not panicked, firm and directional. The way you grip something valuable that you are not going to let go of under any circumstances. He pulled her into the space beneath the heavy banquet table, moving low and fast, using the table as cover between them and the blast site. In the same motion, she heard him speak into the comm on his collar, voice absolutely flat and steady. Code 7. Main Hall, Eastern Wall breach. Ambassador is secured. All units respond. All around them, the hall was chaos. The Velhari delegation had dropped to the floor in their instinctive defense posture, which involved spreading their secondary limbs outward and going perfectly still. The Critheri, who had no strong reaction to pressure waves, were the first back on their feet, heads turning, calculating. 3 of the Draenok's honor guard had moved toward the blast site. Two of the human station staff were already helping an injured Solmari official who had caught a piece of flying panel across the shoulder. Under the table, Marcus was not crouching. He was kneeling, facing out, eyes moving in a slow, controlled sweep across the hall. He held something in his other hand, a compact security sidearm she hadn't known he was carrying. His heart rate, she would think later, must have been elevated. It did not show in anything he did. "Are you injured?" he asked her, not looking at her, still watching the hall. "No." She checked herself. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against her knees. "No, I am not injured." "Good. We're going to move in 30 seconds. There's a service corridor behind the kitchen preparation area, northwest corner. I'm going to keep you against the wall. Don't stop moving regardless of what happens around us." Understood. She almost said something about how she was an ambassador and not accustomed to being given orders. She looked at his face, calm, focused, utterly present, and decided that this was not the moment for that conversation. "Understood," she said. 28 seconds later, they were moving. What happened in those 28 seconds before they ran was something Zyrael would think about for a long time afterward. She watched Marcus watch the room. She watched him identify, without hesitation, that the second Draenok security officer, not the one who had been standing oddly, but a different one, a replacement who had arrived 40 minutes after the event started, was moving toward them at a pace that was not the pace of a person trying to help. It was the pace of a person trying to close distance. She would not have seen it. The movement was subtle to the point of near invisibility. Marcus saw it in the time it took her to blink. He didn't shoot. He didn't shout. He shifted his body angle 5 degrees, made brief eye contact with a council security officer across the room, and moved his free hand in a small specific gesture she didn't recognize. The council officer changed direction immediately, intercepting the false Draenok's guard with 2 colleagues before he covered another 10 meters. Later, when she asked Marcus how he had communicated that without words or comms, he looked mildly surprised that she'd noticed. "We train for nonverbal coordination," he said. "Sometimes the channel is compromised or too slow. You need a way to talk without talking." She filed that away too. The service corridor was narrow and smelled of recycled air and the food residue of a dozen different species' dietary requirements. Marcus moved her through it at a pace that she, taller than him, with longer legs, had to work to match. He kept her against the left wall. He kept himself between her and every intersection they crossed. He did not look at the intersections before he cleared them. He listened first, head tilting in a way she had not noticed him do before, a subtle stillness that lasted less than 2 seconds but was clearly purposeful. They reached the secondary security hub, a reinforced room 2 levels below the main hall, in less than 4 minutes. The door sealed behind them. Inside, 2 station security officers were already at their stations. Marcus lowered his weapon, checked her once more for injury with a fast visual scan, and then stepped back to let the senior security officer take over. That step back was interesting. She noticed it immediately. Some guards, she had experienced, became reluctant to yield control once they had it. The momentum of action made it hard to return to a supporting role. Marcus handed it off without hesitation, not because he was diminished by it, because he understood that his job was to secure her, and now that she was secured, the investigators needed space to do their job without him in the way. The debrief took 2 hours. She sat across from the council's chief security officer, a Velhari named Prethsolan, and answered questions with the careful precision of someone who knew that every word would be analyzed. Marcus sat to her left, slightly behind, and said almost nothing. When Prethsolan asked him to describe the sequence of events, he did so in about 90 seconds, in the kind of exact chronological order that left no room for interpretation. Times, positions, actions, observations. No drama. No self-congratulation. He described identifying the unusual positioning of the first Draenok security officer the way someone might describe noticing a crack in a wall, as information, not as an achievement. Prethsolan, whose species communicated emotional weight through the color of their ear membranes, had membranes that were deep gold the entire time Marcus was speaking. Deep gold, among the Velhari, indicated something close to impressed respect. Zyrael noticed. She was not sure Marcus did. After the debrief, when the room had cleared and they were briefly alone, she looked at him. He was checking the door seals again. Still working. still watching. How did you know? She asked. About the Dranox officer. Before the explosion. He was quiet for a moment. The way he was quiet when he was thinking through something rather than avoiding it. He hadn't eaten, Marcus said finally. The Dranox have a very strong involuntary response to certain food compounds. There were Yelthary seed cakes on the table 12 meters from where he was standing. He never moved toward them. Not once in 40 minutes. I've never met a Dranox who could ignore Yelthary seed cakes. She stared at him. He had identified a security threat using knowledge of an alien species' involuntary biological responses to a specific type of appetizer. He had filed that knowledge away, clearly at some earlier point in his work here, and then retrieved it exactly when it mattered. He had done it while also monitoring 22 other delegations, maintaining his proximity to her, and listening to conversations in at least 3 languages. How long have you been doing this? She asked. This work? 14 years, he said. 8 in the field. 6 in specialist security. She thought about that. 14 years of paying attention to everything, all the time, in high-stakes environments. Of learning the biology and behavior of alien species not because he was curious, though perhaps he was, but because knowing those things might someday save a life. Of being quiet and present and overlooked, and being fine with that, because being overlooked was often the most useful thing a person could be. She thought about how she had barely noticed him for the first 3 weeks. She thought about how that had been, in retrospect, exactly what he had intended. Outside, she could hear the station beginning to stabilize. Emergency teams working, officers coordinating. The enormous, complex machinery of a diplomatic station recovering from a shock. And she sat in a sealed room, unhurt, because a small, fragile human with soft skin and a short lifespan had spent 14 years learning how to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, and had spent 3 weeks learning her well enough to move her to safety before the danger even arrived. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she had quite a lot of new thoughts about humans. The investigation that followed the Meridian Accord reception attack took 11 days and uncovered something that no one had expected. The Council's Security Division, led by Preth Solon and 2 senior analysts, traced the explosive compound to a smuggling network that had been operating inside the station for over 2 years. The network was not affiliated with any of the known dissident groups. It was affiliated with something much older and much quieter, a faction within the Crithari political structure that had decided, with cold calculation, that the Meridian Accord was bad for Crithari interests, and that removing the architect of the Accord's most recent phase would buy them the time they needed to collapse it entirely. The architect, by that calculation, was Zyriel. She read the report in her suite on the 3rd morning after the attack, sitting at the low table near the window that looked out onto the station's outer ring. The stars beyond moved slowly, the station's rotation giving them the illusion of drifting. She read every line carefully. She was not particularly afraid. She had worked in diplomacy long enough to know that being targeted meant you were doing something consequential. What occupied her thoughts was the scope of it, the planning, the patience, the 2 years of slow preparation that had gone into a single evening's event. Marcus was standing near the door. He had read the report already. She could tell by the quality of his stillness. It was a different quality than his usual watchful quiet. This was the stillness of someone who had processed new information and was running it against everything he already knew. They'll try again, she said. It was not a question. Yes, he said. No softening. No hesitation. She found, oddly, that she appreciated this. How long do you think we have? He thought about it. The network is partially exposed now. They know we know some of it. They'll want to move before we find the rest. I'd estimate 2 weeks, maybe less, before they make another attempt. And what do you recommend? He looked at her for a moment before answering, and she had the sense that he was deciding how much of his actual thinking to share. I'd like to change your visible routine, he said. Make it unpredictable. Not just the timing, the behavior, the routes, the choices. You have a pattern, Ambassador. It's a good pattern for a diplomat. It's a bad pattern for a target. You've been studying my patterns. Since the first day, he said, without any apology in it, because it was his job and they both understood that. She nodded slowly. And the other thing you're thinking? He looked mildly surprised. She noted that she had surprised him. This was not common, based on her observation of his reactions, or rather his lack of them. What other thing? There's always another thing, she said. You think in layers. I've watched you do it. There's what you say, which is always true and always useful. And then there's the next layer underneath, which you're deciding whether to share. He was quiet for longer this time. Then, I think the attack at the reception was partly meant to tell us something. Not just to harm you. To show us that they could reach you anywhere on this station, even at a guarded event, even with full security protocols. It was a demonstration. A demonstration for whom? For the other delegations. The ones who are undecided about the Accord. The message isn't just that you're vulnerable. It's that the Accord is vulnerable. That backing it carries risk. He paused. If I'm right, the next attempt won't be at a security event. It'll be somewhere that makes a different point. Somewhere that looks like the station can't protect anyone, not just you. She thought about this for a long time. Outside, the stars drifted slowly past the window. You're saying the target might not be me specifically. It might be the idea that this place is safe. The place or the process. The Accord itself. He met her eyes. Someone is trying to end what you've built. They're using you as the visible part, but the actual target is bigger. This was, she realized, an extraordinary level of strategic thinking for a bodyguard to be doing. She said so, carefully, not as a diminishment, but as a genuine observation. He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen anything close to that expression on his face. My job is to keep you alive, he said. That means understanding the whole picture, not just the person in the room. The whole picture is why someone wants to remove you, which is connected to what you're doing, which is connected to who benefits from stopping you. You can't do this job by looking only at your immediate surroundings. The next 10 days were unlike any Zyriel had experienced in 14 years at Meridian 7. Marcus rebuilt her routine from the ground up. She ate meals at different times. She took different corridors. She varied her meeting start times. She wore different robes in a rotating pattern that made it harder to identify her at distance. She began stopping randomly in corridors to speak with station staff, something she had always been too focused on her next meeting to do, so that her movements became genuinely irregular rather than deliberately irregular in a way that could itself be mapped. She also began, in those 10 days, to actually talk to Marcus. It started practically. She needed to understand her own patterns if she was going to break them, and he was the one who had cataloged them. But it grew into something else. She asked him about the species he had worked with before. He had been a guard for a Velhari scientist for 2 years, early in his career. He had spent 18 months providing security for a Draenox cultural mission on a border station. He had studied the Crithari extensively after an incident. He was brief on the details. That had taught him the hard way that assuming a species' social behavior matched its biological behavior was a mistake that could get people killed. He had learned about Yelthari seed cakes, she eventually discovered, because a Draenox colleague on the border station had once said to him, half joking, that if you ever needed to know whether a Draenox soldier had been replaced by someone in a suit, just put Yelthari seed cakes in the room and wait. He had written it down. He had kept it. 14 years later, it had mattered. Do you write everything down? She asked. The things that seem small, he said. Big things are easy to remember. Small things get lost. But small things are usually what decide it, in the end. She was beginning to understand that Marcus Cole was not merely a competent security professional. He was something rarer, a person who had understood, at some point in his life, that the world was full of information that most people considered beneath their attention, and had decided to pay attention to all of it anyway. Not because he had been told to, because he had seen what happened when you didn't. On the 9th day, the Council's investigation found the second layer of the network. 3 additional individuals, 1 station maintenance worker and 2 supply chain contractors, had been placed by the Crithari faction over the previous 18 months. They were arrested quietly, without announcement, to avoid alerting anyone who might still be embedded. It was a careful operation, and Zyrael was only told about it after the fact. Marcus had known about it 4 hours before she was told. She realized this when she noticed a very slight change in his posture that morning. A fraction less tension in his shoulders, a barely perceptible difference in how he held his stance. When she asked him directly, he confirmed it. He had been included in the security communication loop and had chosen to let the investigators proceed without bringing it to her attention during active operations, because telling her would have changed her behavior in ways that could have tipped off any remaining embedded operatives. She was not offended. She was, once again, simply impressed. He had made a calculated decision to protect her by not giving her information she might have used badly, and he had made that decision correctly. It required understanding both security protocols and her own psychology well enough to know how she would react. He had known. On the 11th day, the investigation was not complete. There was still a third layer that Preth Solin's team could not yet locate. Someone higher, someone with deeper access, who had not yet been identified. The station was safer than it had been 2 weeks ago, but it was not safe. The Critheri faction, knowing the net was tightening, had not yet made their next move. But Marcus's window, 2 weeks, maybe less, was nearly closed. That evening, as Zirael reviewed treaty language that needed to be finalized within the week regardless of everything else happening around her, Marcus stood near the window and said, without preamble, "I need you to attend the Water Garden event tomorrow." She looked up. The Water Garden event was a small, informal gathering in the station's biosphere section, a social occasion, not a political one, attended by perhaps 40 people. She had considered canceling it, given the ongoing threat. Why? Because I think whoever is left in the network is watching our pattern, the same way I watched yours, he said. We've been unpredictable for 11 days. Unpredictability becomes its own pattern if you maintain it too long. If we attend something small and social and relaxed, we look like we've stood down. We look like we think the threat has passed. His eyes were steady. They'll move on it. And we'll be ready. She considered him across the room for a moment. A small, fragile human, standing in the soft light of the station's artificial evening, proposing to use himself and her as bait to draw out an assassin they hadn't yet found. Proposing it the way someone might propose changing the time of a meeting, practically, reasonably, because it was the right tactical decision and he had thought it through. You're very confident, she said. Not in outcomes, he said. In preparation. There's a difference. She looked at her treaty language. She looked at the stars outside. She thought about 14 cycles of work that the Critheri faction wanted to undo in a single night. What time does the Water Garden event begin? She asked. The Water Garden occupied a full quarter of the station's biosphere level. A long, open space filled with the sound of moving water, soft blue spectrum lighting calibrated to comfort the broadest range of species, and an extraordinary variety of aquatic plants from 17 different worlds. The Solmari had contributed a cluster of luminescent water reeds that glowed faintly in the ambient temperature. The Velhari had installed a deep channel of something that looked like liquid bronze and behaved in ways that defied easy explanation. There were fish-like creatures from 4 different oceans, separated by transparent membrane dividers, and the air smelled of minerals and something floral that Zirael could not identify, but found, somehow, calming. She arrived at the event at the time Marcus had suggested, 20 minutes after it began, when the gathering was settled and social and the presence of additional arrivals would draw minimum attention. She wore the mid-blue robe rather than her diplomatic formal attire. She carried nothing except the small communication band all Solmari wore at the wrist. She moved through the garden easily, greeting the people she recognized, making the kind of conversation that was warm and general and revealed nothing about anything. She was, to every observer, a diplomat in a relaxed social setting who believed the worst of recent events was behind her. She could see Marcus in her peripheral vision, positioned near the main water channel, holding a glass of something the humans called mineral water and speaking occasionally with a station botanist. He looked, to any observer, like a man enjoying a quiet evening. His eyes had not stopped moving since they walked in. The trap, as he had designed it, worked on a simple principle. They had fed a piece of information to a controlled section of the station's internal communication network, a piece of information suggesting that Zirael would be meeting privately with the Council's chief investigator at the Water Garden, away from formal security settings, at a specific point in the evening. It was the kind of information that a network with embedded operatives might receive. It was the kind of opportunity that a desperate faction, watching their embedded agents get arrested one by one, might decide they could not afford to waste. The information was not true. There was no private meeting. There was only the garden, the social gathering, and a concealed security arrangement that Marcus had spent 2 days quietly coordinating with Preth Solin's team. 6 plainclothes security officers, 3 human, 2 Velhari, 1 Draenox whose genuine loyalty had been thoroughly verified, were positioned throughout the space. 2 more were in the service corridor that ran along the biosphere's eastern wall. None of them were obvious. All of them were waiting. Zyrael moved through the gathering and let herself feel the water garden the way she had not let herself feel anything in 11 days. The sound of the water, the soft colors of the bioluminescent reeds her homeworld had sent, the low murmur of conversations in 6 languages. She thought about the accord, about the years of careful work, the compromises, the small victories accumulated one at a time, the fragile thing that 14 cycles of diplomacy had built. She thought about what it would mean if it held, what it would mean for the species that were still deciding whether to believe that cooperation was possible. She thought about that, and then she let herself walk slowly beside the long water channel and wait. The attempt came from above. She did not see it. She heard a sound. Not loud, not explosive, more like the sharp crack of something under stress. And then Marcus was in front of her with his back to her, and something ricocheted off the containment shield that materialized from a device he had activated in the same half-second it took him to cross the space between them. A directed energy weapon. Precise. Quiet. Designed for close spaces where a conventional explosive would do too much collateral damage and draw too much immediate response. Designed, in other words, for a garden. What followed was not long. The shooter had been positioned in the maintenance gantry above the biosphere, a position that gave line of sight to the primary water channel where Zyrael had been standing. They had moved into position during the event's first 20 minutes, using a maintenance access code that had not yet been flagged in the network sweep. It was the third layer that Solin's team had been unable to locate, not a person, as it turned out, but an access credential that had been quietly compromised 8 months earlier and had been sitting and used, waiting for exactly this moment. The shooter was a Crithari contractor who had been working on the station's atmospheric systems for 7 months. She was identified, contained, and removed from the garden in under 4 minutes by the plainclothes team, with minimal disruption to the guests who were unaware of what had happened. Most of the attendees registered only that there had been a brief commotion near the water channel. 2 Velhari guests who had sensitive enough hearing to have detected the energy discharge looked mildly alarmed and were smoothly redirected by station staff before they could cause a secondary panic. Zyrael was aware of all of this from behind Marcus, who did not lower the shield or move from his position until Solin's personal confirmation came through on the secure comm channel. Only then did he step back, check her face, check her hands, check the space around them with a single sweeping look, and say, "It's clear." Her voice, when she found it, was very steady. She was Solmari. She was a diplomat. She had survived 2 attacks in 11 days. She was not going to be undone by the second one either. "Good," she said. But her bioluminescent markings, she noticed, had gone a deep, warm amber, a color that among her species indicated something close to profound relief, the particular relief that arrived after you had been holding fear very tightly for a very long time and had been given permission, at last, to set it down. She could not control the markings. They simply were. Marcus looked at them for a moment. She watched him file the meaning away. She knew he would look it up later, if he didn't already know, and he probably already knew. He said nothing. He simply gave her a small, quiet nod that meant he understood she was all right. The days that followed were loud in the way that quiet things become loud when they finally break open. The Crithari faction's involvement was no longer containable as a secret. It was too large, too documented, too many arrests, and too much evidence. The political fallout within the Crithari governance structure was significant. There were 3 resignations within the first week. The Crithari ambassador to Meridian 7, who had been genuinely uninvolved, the investigation confirmed, issued a formal apology to the council in language that the Crithari reserved for moments of extraordinary gravity. The Meridian Accord, rather than collapsing as the faction had intended, gained 2 additional signatures in the 10 days following the garden incident. Species that had been watching from the edges of the conversation decided, apparently, that an agreement worth trying to destroy through assassination was an agreement worth examining more seriously. It was not the outcome anyone had planned. It was, Zyrael thought, the kind of outcome that emerged when a long game collided with a species that simply refused to give up and lie down. She requested that Marcus Cole be kept on her security detail for the foreseeable future. The council approved it without question. Solin, whose ear membranes remained deep gold for most of the conversation in which this was discussed, remarked that the human had performed at a level that most Velhari specialists with twice the experience would have found difficult to match. This was the highest compliment that the Velhari gave. Zyrael noted that Marcus, when this was relayed to him, looked quietly pleased for about 3 seconds and then returned to checking the door seals. She had a conversation with him the evening after the formal security review was completed that she would remember for a very long time. They were actually sitting, which was unusual, both of them in chairs in her suite's small sitting area, because she had asked him to sit and he had, after a brief pause, agreed. She had tea. He had the same mineral water he always drank. Outside, the stars moved slowly past the window. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to accept it without deflecting it." He raised an eyebrow, which among humans indicated cautious attention. "All right. When I was assigned a human guard," she said, "I thought it was a compromise. A neutral choice. Something safe and unimportant and easy to overlook." She paused. "I was wrong. Not about you being easy to overlook. You are, deliberately, and brilliantly so. I was wrong about the rest of it. I was wrong about what humans are, and what you are specifically, and I want you to know that I understand that now." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Most species are wrong about humans, initially. We don't look like much." "No," she agreed. "You don't. You have no armor. No enhanced biology. Your lifespans are short. Your bodies require constant maintenance. By every biological measurement the Council uses, you are fragile." "Yes," he said. "But you spent 14 years learning everything there is to know about every species you have ever worked with, because small things decided in the end. You identified a threat from an appetizer. You moved me out of a blast radius before I knew there was a blast. You read a room full of 22 species simultaneously and found the one wrong note in it. You designed a trap that worked because you understood not just how security works, but how a desperate, cornered faction thinks." She looked at him. "That is not fragile." He considered this. She had the sense, again, that he was deciding how much of himself to share. "We had a long time," he said finally, "on Earth, before anyone else was out here. We had a long time where the only dangerous things we faced were each other, and the planet, and whatever was trying to eat us. We developed specific things. Attention, pattern recognition, stubbornness." He almost smiled again, that rare expression. "We don't stop. That's really the core of it. Everything else is a skill you can learn. The not stopping, that's what we're made of." Zyrael thought about 14 cycles of diplomacy, about the slow, difficult work of building something fragile and important between species that didn't always want to be built together, about what it meant to not stop. "Perhaps," she said, "that is not so different from what a diplomat is made of." He looked at her for a moment, and this time the almost smile became, briefly, an actual one. "No," he said, "not so different." Outside the window, Meridian 7 continued its slow rotation, and the stars moved as they always had, ancient and enormous and utterly indifferent to the small, extraordinary things happening in their light. A Solmari ambassador and a human guard sat in a quiet room and understood each other, perhaps for the first time, and perhaps more thoroughly than most species managed even after centuries of trying. The accord held. The station breathed. And somewhere in the long record of the Galactic Council's history, a footnote was being quietly written, that when the eldest races had dismissed the newest member of their community as soft, fragile, and unremarkable, they had made an error in measurement. They had measured the wrong things entirely.